You're listening to the Recovering Methodism podcast, a global Methodist voice for navigating life and ministry in the 21st century, tackling the issues impacting the church, and recovering the distinctly Methodist practices to participate in the next great awakening. And now your hosts, David Cady and Caleb Spiker.
Hey, Dave.
What's up, Caleb?
Man, it's a beautiful day here in Ohio.
It is a gorgeous October day.
Yeah. Well, this is our first episode of the Recovering Methodism podcast.
Exciting. Very exciting.
Whew. We should probably talk about something important.
It's a good idea. In fact, I'd make the suggestion we talk about stuff that's important every time, but if we're leading off with this, let's go big or go home.
All right. Well, here's a nice softball question for you. In the big scheme of all the religious options that are in the world today, why Christianity?
So why Christianity as opposed to all the other religions
why
or
aren't
belief
you,
systems that might exist in the world?
Why aren't you Hindu or Jewish or a Satanist or?
Oh, my goodness. Well, lots of options.
So
I think I need to preface my response to this by saying I grew up in Southeast Ohio, okay? So
it's between Christianity and paganism.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's not a lot of options to choose from when you grew up where I grew up in the time that I grew up. But now that I live in the metro area of Columbus, I realize, there's a lot of options that a person can choose from. And if I was, say, 18 to 25, at this point, I'd say, what are all the options out there, right? And so you raise a great question, why Christianity? And just off the top of my head, I would say that Christianity offers something that no other worldview, no other religion offers. And while I'm not an expert in world religion, I would say my understanding is that every other worldview, every other religion indicates that the way you connect with God is by your own effort, your own work, right? You have to live in such a way that demonstrates your capacity to do good, to be good, to achieve everything you need to achieve. Whereas Christianity doesn't do that. Christianity starts with God and God's gracious love and response to us. Wesley would say that's the nature of prevenient grace. In fact, I would say Orthodox Christianity, well before Wesley, would emphasize the importance of God's initiative to us. And so it's important, I think, from my perspective, why Christianity? Because it starts with God, not with us. This relationship with God is not our idea, it's God's idea. And so I'm drawn to Christianity, not only because culturally that's what I was presented with as a young person, but even as I've explored and studied over the years as a Christian pastor, I would say that it makes the most sense. The older I get, to realize that I don't have a lot to offer God, okay? Not a whole lot to offer at all.
Nope.
And what I do have to offer is tainted and contaminated, filled with self-interest and self-desire, and this just broken. Yeah. And so Christianity starts, the Bible, Genesis 1, in the beginning, God. And I would say to anybody who may be listening who's not sure about Christianity, who's not sure about what the message is, it starts with God's gracious interest and invitation to us, undeserving as we may be. God initiates the relationship. That's why, for me, I think Christianity makes sense.
Well, and I think, beyond just the intellectual pieces, for me, it rings out in my spirit and in my inner person the truth of the claims of the Bible.
Okay.
There are all sorts of intellectual exercises that can go on, but at the end of the day, intuitively, the Holy Spirit speaks into my life and says, "This is true."
Yeah.
Which can be a dangerous thing if you are on an island, but that's the gift of the community. Yeah. That we have a community of people who together have heard the voice of the Spirit to say, this is true. Jesus is who he says he is.
Right.
the gift of grace that God gives is for all of you. But so you hinted that we are Methodist type people. So why Wesleyanism?
Well, there's all kinds of options, obviously, within Christianity of how we might approach our faith journey. Again, having grown up where I grew up in an era that I grew up,
Could be Methodist or Baptist,
basically that's it.
or a snake handler.
Well, not that far south, not that far south. However, I mean, I grew up in a church that was, at least at the very early stages of my earthly existence, was EUB. It was Evangelical United Brethren. And even though by default they became United Methodist at that time, they never really stopped being EUB, right? And so that's part of that Wesleyan Arminian background that I grew up. It's kind of mixed as far as whether it's from a German heritage or an English heritage, but here we are, right? And so I'm just going to speak as much as I can with a Wesleyan accent and say that a Wesleyan approach to Christianity makes the most sense to me because it doesn't put all the emphasis on God's sovereignty working out everything in my life, and I don't do anything. It actually allows me to be a part of what God is unfolding in my life, that I have some responsibility. And the language I like to use around that is that it's, God initiates the relationship by his grace, but my response to grace has value and is valid in the narrative. And from a Wesleyan perspective, it's the response to grace that oftentimes gets elevated as an important part of the narrative, important part of the story. That our response to grace is part of the theology of a Wesleyan approach to Christianity.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So for me, I didn't grow up in Southeast Ohio. I grew up in Northwest Central Ohio, and grew up in a Methodist church. That a strange thing was happening because I went to school like during the young, restless, and reformed rage. So my friends who were older who went off to school, they all came back reformed, all of them. And then when I went to a Reformed Baptist college, I had basically assumed I would come back reformed too. But the strangest thing happened. I was in a modern theology class where we were reading some Barth, and kind of also I was simultaneously taking like a church fathers class. So I'm reading Augustine, and I'm reading Aquinas, and I'm reading the Desert Fathers and these people. And the in reading Barth, he has his own sort of version of the quadrilateral, which for my money is better than Outler's version of the quadrilateral.
Wow.
Let me just say.
That may be its own episode, by the way.
Yeah, it is. And that led me to reading the standard 44 sermons of Wesley, and I found the single clearest articulation of the Christianity being described by Augustine and Athanasius and the Desert Fathers in the English language I'd ever heard. I said, this is apostolic Christianity. Like this is the genius of Wesley and the genius of the Methodist movement is that it cuts away all the fluff and the sophistication and gets back to this very basic, very primitive picture of the Christian faith.
Right.
And it's that primal religion that really appeals to me.
How old were you when you were 18, 19, 20? What?
20, 21, something like that.
Okay. So I didn't go to a reform school. I went to Harvard on the Hocking, right? I went to OU.
Oh, there you go.
So
your problem wasn't fighting legalism, it was fighting hedonism.
Probably so. That's probably the truth, right? But yet what I found so attractive in the Wesleyan message, by the way, I think I began to really experience that in depth a little later than you as far as in that age range. I was closer to 23, 24. I was saved when I was a kid, had a very profound experience with the message of the gospel, 7 years old. But fast forward about 15, 16, 17 years, and God was doing a new thing in me. Not because of anything that I was doing. There was a response, but it was very basic. It was like a crack of a window that I was allowing God to have in my life. And that's all God needed.
Yeah.
Was just me to throw open the window just a little bit.
A little fresh air.
A little fresh air.
And fresh fire comes
and
with
I'm
it.
telling you, as I look, that was 30 years ago, but as I look back at it, I'm like, man, God was doing something amazing.
Yeah.
And what I began to fall in love with in the Wesleyan perspective of Christianity, two things, is what Wesley called heart religion, right? This personal, sometimes emotional encounter with God. So it wasn't all head knowledge. It wasn't all just adherence to an intellectual assent to a set of doctrines. There was this experience of God, this heart religion. And the second thing the Wesley would say, I think, is practical divinity. Okay, what I'm reading, what I'm experiencing, has value in my everyday life.
Yeah.
Okay, so heart religion, practical divinity, really captured my imagination when I was 23, 24 years old, and it really changed the trajectory of my life. I wouldn't be sitting here at this moment had it not been for those moments. I remember I was 23, 24 years old, and I started reading the hymnal for my devotional time.
There you go.
And
it was the only theology book of our previous denomination.
that's accurate, right?
Yeah.
And so I grew up in a home where my mom was choir director in the church. And so I grew up with the hymns, hearing them not only in church but at the home.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until that point when I had opened the window a little bit and the fresh air was coming in, the fresh wind of the Spirit, and I'm reading the doctrine in the hymns, I'm like, that's what that means. And literally moved to tears based on what I'm reading in the lyrics of the hymns that I had known all my life. And the dots started to connect, and I'm like, holy cow, this is real. And I wasn't able to articulate it well at that point in my life, but I knew that God was doing something. And that's a really special moment, especially in a young person's life, when deep inside you know that God is doing something, even if you can't articulate it and you can't express it. And for me, I think that's Wesley's Aldersgate experience, right? My heart was strangely warmed.
Yeah.
He knew something was going on.
Yeah.
It was strangely warmed. He couldn't articulate it. And for me, that's the attraction of Wesleyan theology, the Wesleyan experience of Christianity.
Yeah.
Let me dial that back. I'm getting excited. So,
Be a shouting Methodist.
yeah, there's nothing wrong with that, right?
And so we've talked about like why Christianity, why Wesleyanism, and there are lots of Methodist and Wesleyan brothers and sisters. You
Sure.
have Free Methodists, you have Nazarenes, you have United Methodists, you have Primitive Methodists, which is a little tiny denomination in Northeast Ohio and Pennsylvania, which has the best name of all of our brothers and sisters.
Primitive Methodists, yeah.
You have Wesleyan Methodists. You have
Pilgrim Holiness, right?
Pilgrim Holiness. Yeah.
Sure.
You and I, we are Global Methodist elders. Why Global Methodism?
Well, that's a great question. I would say first and foremost, again, by default, in that I've been a United Methodist pastor for nearly 30 years, been preaching in the United Methodist Church for 30 years, been an elder for over 20 years. And the context of where I find myself in history and in my ministerial career is I'm in a church that just didn't feel as though United Methodism was part of its future, so we disaffiliated. And by default, I theoretically disaffiliated with them, okay?
Yep.
And we find ourselves now part of a global Methodist movement. So by default, I'll say it that way, but also by choice. Okay, it's not that we didn't have any other options, but to be a part of a movement that is trying to recover this Wesleyan Methodist perspective with the emphasis on holiness, on the importance of faith and repentance, and be a part of something brand new that's not contextualized but it's global. That understanding that we have brothers and sisters in Africa and Europe and Asia, where the Spirit is moving profoundly, and that they are not in a position where they have to be dependent upon the elite theology of United States Methodists, but or the money of Methodism within the United States, but we can learn from them, and see, what is the Spirit doing globally within this Methodist movement that is becoming known as global Methodism. That's exciting. For me, it's a great way to spend the next 10 to 15 years of ministry if God allows it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What about you?
Yeah. You know, I think it's the newness more than anything else that appeals to me, right? Like we've, you know, the Methodism that I read about in Wesley's sermons and in his brother Charles' hymns,
Right.
and in
Right.
you know, the historical accounts of the United Societies, is a far cry from the Methodism I've experienced in the 21st century in North America, and all of its different flavors. And something new has the opportunity to recover something old.
Mm.
And that's my hope, is that since we're in the wild, wild west stage of the development of this denomination, that we can, you know, that we can be a part of recovering that distinctly Methodist identity. Because I don't think the world needs another conservative evangelical denomination. We have plenty of them.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even need a conservative version of the United Methodist Church.
No.
What we need is actual Methodism.
Okay.
Actual Methodism can make a massive difference in the lives of hurting people,
Right.
you know, in the United States and Canada and Mexico and the rest of the world on the other
Right.
6 inhabited continents, and even for, you know, the penguins in Antarctica.
Right.
Well, not the penguins, but the people who study the
There you
penguins.
go.
You know what I'm saying? It's like I want to see what God is going to do in this movement, in this stage of the Christian story, and, you know, being global Methodist, I think, gives us a front row seat to it, to see it both in Columbus,
Right.
and also in Nairobi, Kenya,
Yeah.
and also in you know, Manila, Philippines,
Right.
and in, you know, Houston, Texas, and
Right.
like, we have this this ability to be connected in a way that we never have been before.
Right. Minus the politics and minus the maneuvering for power. That's our hope, right?
That's our hope. That's our hope. And, you know, I think there's a chance that we can actually see that happen. And, you know, I'm a hopeful guy.
Yeah.
Like,
well.
I'm Harry here telling Mary Swanson, so there's a chance. You know, because the history and the players would suggest that, you know, it's going to be a challenge. You know, it doesn't take long for most religious movements to become corrupted and institutionalized
Sure.
and problematic.
Sure.
But there's a chance.
There's a chance.
And even if it's just for you know, the life of my ministry career, you know, I'm ready to hang on tight for 35 years and see what happens.
Well, there's something to be said about that. And I don't know what kind of difference I can make in Kenya or the Philippines. I'm just a pastor here in Columbus, Ohio. But what I'm seeing in the past 9 months here at Riverside, as people maybe hear us online or show up and visit, and a lot of the folks that are coming right now are from other United Methodist churches or in other churches within the Columbus area that their mainline congregation has really gone far, you know, left or can become woke, so to speak, in their theology, is they come hungering for an articulate, well thought out, orthodox expression of biblical Christianity. Yeah. And our desire is to offer that and provide that week after week after week after week in an authentic way. And what I'm seeing and hearing from folks is they're starving for that.
Yeah.
And so while by default I'm a global Methodist because of the life circumstances I find myself in, I had a dream a few weeks ago that there were people that I was in ministry with, colleagues, if you will, and in the dream they were asking me why I left the West Ohio Conference, and my response to them in the dream was, there was no place for me. Now I know the reality is I would have been appointed somewhere because of the guaranteed appointment system.
Yeah.
But what I think I was expressing in the dream was there was no good fit for me. This is a good fit for me. Because it allows me to be in ministry in a context that really needs to be filled. I mean, we're in the heart of Columbus, Ohio. We're the only global Methodist church within 270. There are great global Methodist congregations around Columbus in the metro area. I can name 4 or 5 off the top of my head. But the only one in 270, inside 270, inside the loop in Columbus with a Columbus address, that's it. This is us. So we have this great opportunity that the Lord has afforded us to do something long-lasting.
Well, and I think about how much of a blessing it can be for the world around us to, experience that middle way of Methodism, right? Because like if you have boys in their 20s, right? So undoubtedly they have found on YouTube the Jordan Petersons and Jocko Willinicks and David Goggins and Andrew Hubermans and these build these perfectly disciplined, regimented lives and everything will be okay.
Right.
But the problem, and there's great value in that. It's certainly better than the do whatever you want.
Sure.
Which is the other ditch, right? Like if you're going to fall in a ditch, fall in the ultra disciplined ditch.
Right.
But I think the benefit of this movement where we are pursuing radical holiness and accountable community is one, it gives us a community to do it with, and that Wesleyan distinctive where discipline is not about discipline, it's about freedom, where instead of simply living this disciplined life and expecting the disciplines themselves to save us, what the disciplines allow us to do as Methodists is to create enough space in our lives for God to show up and do something new.
That's right.
That these disciplines, they create the space and the structure in our lives for God to restore us to who we're supposed to be.
Right.
And I see the appeal of these disciples of discipline, and it's like it's almost right,
almost Christian, as Wesley would say, right?
At least as
almost Christian,
almost Christian. Because what's the line from that sermon? You can be as orthodox as the devil.
That's great.
And twice as wicked.
That's great.
Right. So we have this we have the spiritual food that our culture is hungering for,
right? And
they don't even know it yet,
right?
This place where embracing a life of discipline leads to freedom and leads to an encounter with the living God.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I'm just saying, I can't wait to see how that plays out to make a difference in people's lives over the next, as long as I get to live.
Well, I want to reiterate what you said, and you've said it before in conversation with me, and it bears repeating. The disciplines, the means of grace, which are thoroughly Wesleyan, right?
Ordinances of God.
They create the space for God to work.
That's right.
Right? They create the space within us for God to work. They are not a means to an end, but they kind of lay the foundation and maybe throw open the window enough for that fresh wind of the Spirit to move in. That's my personal experience.
Yep.
That thoroughly changed my life 3 decades ago. It's not, I don't think, a stretch of the imagination for me to look back and say that experience when I was 23, 24 provided the window for God's call on my life to be experienced. I don't think I would have ever experienced the call to be in ministry had that window of faith been open just enough.
Yeah.
So, and I'll tell you, in my personal experience, that took about 30 days. Okay? And it took 3 years to wrestle through, to discern what it all meant. But as I look back, that experience of throwing open the window just a little bit, 30 days later is when I had my first experience of a call to ministry. That quickly. Okay? And so creating space for God to work is spot on. It's spot on.
And now it's time for Caleb's Library.
We have come to a part of our podcast we call Caleb's Library. And as you can see behind me, we have quite a plethora of books that are part of Caleb's Library. I'm sure you may have some at home as well. In other words, this is not an all-inclusive library right now.
There are a few.
Right. So I think it's great that there's an opportunity each week to talk about a book that perhaps you have found helpful or one that you're currently reading. You're going to be a more prolific reader than I am. And so what I like to say is that my library consists of the cliff notes of the books that you're reading. And so
You're welcome.
I appreciate it very much. And so this is an opportunity to find out what you're reading. And you have a book right here in front of us. Tell us a little bit about this book that you are currently reading.
So this is actually a book I finished here pretty recently. And it was a book that I did not want to like.
Why did you not want to like it?
You see, Dave, my wife, she has an affinity for the pretty boy pastors in Portland. And this was written by one of those pretty boy pastors in Portland. 6'3", $180, bearded Tyler Staton at Bridgetown Church. I don't want to like Comer or Staton or Mackey or any of those tall, skinny Portlanders.
Yeah.
But man, it's so good.
Yeah?
It was such a good book.
So let me just stop there. I see the book. I think I shared this with you a couple of days ago, that this title popped up somehow on my Instagram feed. And I thought, well, that's an interesting title. I wonder what Caleb would think about that title, because you've often talked about sort of a monastic life and things of that nature. So it's interesting that I think the very next day you mentioned this book to me in one of our conversations. And so what led you to actually purchase the book if you didn't have an affinity for the author in the first place? But why did you choose to get this book? First of all, it's called what? Praying like monks, living like fools.
Yeah.
Praying like monks, living like fools. Got it. So what led you to buy the book?
I didn't buy the book. My wife bought the book.
Are you serious?
I'm completely serious.
Okay.
I wouldn't knowingly support the skinny pant wearing, good looking
Pretty boy pastors
in Portland.
I gotcha. So Cindy bought the book for you.
Well, she bought the book for her.
She bought the book for her. Has she read it yet?
Yeah.
She read it and said, "You need to read it."
She did.
Okay. You need to grow a beard. I mean, was that part of the conversation?
No, she doesn't like beards, right? Like, I think my only redeeming help in all this is that he has a beard, so that makes him less awesome.
I need to know, did the book come with a pair of skinny jeans?
No.
No. Okay. Okay. Just want to make sure.
Not this time.
Okay. So tell us, Cindy got the book. She read it, said, "Hey, you might like this." So here we are.
Yeah. And like I said, I did not want to like it. But it was so good. It's so good. So for me, like there are two kinds of books that I find helpful. There are the books that are really well written, and the whole thing is just this beautiful symphony of thought and argument and examples. And like I read a book on the Sabbath by a New York Times editor, Julia Schleiverth, I think her name is. And it was probably the most beautifully written book I've ever
I think
read.
I've heard Keller quote her a lot.
I mean, this book it's beautiful.
Yeah.
It is a work of art.
Okay.
And I mean, there was interesting, valuable things about Sabbath practice, but just the writing was so gripping.
Right.
It was remarkable. So I mean, this is one sort of book that I appreciate and I find a lot of value and edification in. And then there are the books that are not as well written, but just chock full of nuggets, right? So like you have these two sort of things that, in my mind, are the utility of reading. Because I'm if I'm reading nonfiction, it's probably like before bed to the boys. Most of my reading is did I say not? If I'm reading fiction, it's before bed with the boys. Most of my readings, nonfiction, largely it's church stuff or leadership management stuff. Occasionally, I'll let myself indulge in scientific journal-y type thing that's really interesting. But for the most part, it's church stuff.
Okay.
Largely surrounding spiritual formation and disciplines. And this was a book that both did an amazing job of telling stories in the different ways that prayer has brought about a deeper experience of God in his life and in the life of his church. But then also that just has these nuggets. It's like, gosh, that's good. So he has one quote in here where he says, the mature Christian community is not one without sin, it's one without secrets.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're not playing games with this. If we're going to be mature, we're realizing that we're not perfect, but we're authentic. That's the gist of it?
And it calls us to repentance.
So share the quote again.
So a mature Christian community is not one without sin, it's one without secrets.
Okay.
It's one where we're able to expose the shortcomings and the disobedience and the ignorance of ourselves personally and of our community more broadly to the light, so that it can be dealt with.
So we know that all of us are broken people, and we don't pretend that we're not. We're imperfect, but we have a perfect Savior who not only loves us, but who is willing to heal us and make us whole. And part of that process, as I understand what you're saying, is being authentic in community to the point where we're honest and willing to let the love of God personally, but also in a communal aspect, bring us to that place of repentance and healing. Is that what I understand?
Okay. That's his argument.
Okay.
Another nugget from the book is, he found in his research for it the prayer of enough, which is kind of a Jewish prayer practice, where you start with one thing you're thankful for, and then you peel back the layers of just how much more it is than what we need. So it could be an example of if just having something to eat, that would be enough. But Lord, you exceed that and give me something to eat that's delicious. And something that's delicious to eat would be enough, but you give me people to share it with, who I can break bread with and enjoy that. And it would be enough if it was just delicious food with any random person, but it's people who I really like and who give me life. And this way of recognizing that blessings are just this compounded outgrowth of the little thing that would be enough, that God just fills with all the little things and the big things that truly make it joyful.
So we hear that echoed, I think, in Paul's little mini benediction in the middle of the book of Ephesians, Ephesians 3:20, I believe it is, that God is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. And that's not just a cosmic mystic kind of idea, but it's lived out practically if we recognize all the blessings that the giver of every good thing gives us in each moment, whether it's not only bread to eat, but delicious bread, like Cindy's gluten-free bread, right? But the people we get to share it, that's what you're saying, is we get to see layer upon layer upon layer of God's goodness toward us, which should, I think, if we're aware of it, create gratitude and an attitude of worship in the everyday living of life. So a little more about this book. Tell us, you've given us a few nuggets. Why should I, or why should anybody else pick up this book and read it? What's a takeaway for us besides those two things? Tell us a little bit about where it leads us in the table of contents and where we might expect it to lead us.
Yeah, I think one of the chapters, because the dirty little secret about most books is that most authors give you everything valuable in the first 4 to 6 chapters.
Right.
Then the rest are just fillers to get to a length sufficient for the publisher to publish.
Right.
And in late in this book, he has 4 chapters where he is talking about different prayer practices and how they play out. And really, the entire book is about prayer practices. But typically there are 3 or 4 prayer practices, and then you just kind of flitter away the rest of it to get to your page number.
Gotcha.
But it doesn't stop, right? Like every chapter is written with the same level of care and intensity. And I think in the chapter 7, where he talks about prayer as participation, where it's not that God is the cosmic butler who gives entitled children whatever they ask to, and it's not that you are powerless and that you get what you get and you don't make a fit, but that there's this middle place where the faithful pray from, where you pray with expectancy in the character of God. So, there's a way that you pray, and as an oldest child, I tend to fall into that oldest child prayer practice of, oh, Lord, we'd really love to see this thing happen, but, only if it's your will, your will be done.
That's interesting.
Whereas, I've known younger children, especially youngest children, who almost pray with like an entitlement, right? Like, this is what I want, God, and I expect you to get there, right?
That's me.
And Staton say no, like the truly faithful prayer practice is somewhere in the middle, where for the oldest child, that sort of determinist thing, if God decides to be a jerk, you just have to live with it, right? Like there's not always a trusting in the character of God's goodness and in God's desire to bring blessing and not woe. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have the people who pray with the entitlement that God should be giving me what I want when I want it. Mm-hmm. But know that that faithful prayer is this place where you are recognizing the goodness of God and praying with intentionality towards that, recognizing that God knows better than you do, mm-hmm. and what you want may not actually be what's best for you.
Yeah. That's mature. That's a mature approach to prayer, I think, right?
Yeah. And even like, in the next to last chapter, he's talking about persistent prayer, and how in our instant gratification society, we shortchange everything God wants to do when we, pray once, pray twice, pray 3 times, it hasn't happened. Must not be in God's will. It's like, well, maybe, or maybe there is some value in learning how to wait. He has a prayer on praying for those who don't know Jesus. I think, if I remember correctly, he talks about Moody, who had 100 people in his Bible who was praying for on a daily basis that they would come to know Jesus. And at his death, 96 had become Christians, and in the 10 years after he died, the last 4 did. Right? And it's like there's, this is a different sort of expectation of God's goodness and God's grace to be at work in people's lives than the simple, either if you want this wayward family member to be a Christian, you're going to do it, or by golly, you have to, right? So I mean, they work together. It was a good read, and one I'll come back to.
So I'll just say real quick here, the persistence of prayer is important, and we read that in Luke 18, right? The parable of the widow who goes to the judge. But Luke tells us right up front that the parable is about persistence, that they should always pray and not give up.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. At the latter part of this book, as you've mentioned, he didn't give you fluff at the end. He drives home really what I would consider, and I haven't read the book, obviously, what I would consider a mature approach to prayer. So, again, give us the title and the author in case those who have tuned in maybe didn't catch it earlier. And this will give us an idea of perhaps a resource that someone may want to use for their own edification or perhaps for preaching.
Yep, the book is Praying Like Monks, Living Like Fools by Tyler Staton, and he is the pastor at a Bridgetown church in Portland.
Staton, Staton.
Staton, like
Praying,
Stanton without the N.
Praying like monks, living like fools. Well, I appreciate this episode of Caleb's Library. Looking forward to what books Cindy give you next from the pretty boy preachers that she wants you to become more like.
Yeah, so what are you reading right now?
I'm going to read Praying Like Monks, Living Like Fools.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Now for some practical wisdom for church leaders. Let's open up the pastor's toolbox.
Well, Dave, we've gotten to the portion of our program that we are going through the toolbox. Pull out, because as our friend Tom Hanover likes to say, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Makes sense.
So we are talking about the tools that as pastors we use on a consistent basis, and today we are talking about sermon planning, how to think through a season of preaching and what that looks like. Where do you start?
I think everything starts with prayer, right? And discerning where God is leading the congregation, where God is speaking to the preaching team as far as what needs to be proclaimed. And that can vary, of course, depending on season of the year, if you're following liturgical calendar, but especially as you get into the high and holy days of the year. It could also vary depending on what's happening in the life of the church, if there's a specific issue that needs to be addressed. I think also it depends on where the church is in its life stage. You know, churches have life stages, and if it's on a downslope, then you talk about how to overcome that. If things are going well, and you talk about next steps and expanding, things of that nature. So it just depends, but it starts with prayer, prayerfully discerning what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Yes. So what do you think in terms of balancing? So back to our friend Tom Hanover, he used to talk about liking to preach a challenging series followed by a series that is rooted in the promises of God.
Yeah,
so challenge the people, build them up. Challenge them, build them. Do you like to follow a similar rhythm?
I
or?
do. Yeah, I like to talk about it as like every once in a while you got to throw the congregation a bone, right? You can yank all the leash on the leash all you want, but at some point you've got to comfort them. You've got to give them hope and the promise of God, and there has to be balance in that, right? At the same time, there are seasons when you need to push a little bit, and preach the scriptures that lead us to take another step of faith and grow as a congregation, as individuals. So there has to be balance. So I like that, the reference you made to Tom and just having balance in that process.
Yeah. So walk us through maybe the last series or the last couple series, like, what were the pieces? Like, you gave us the high elevation view of how you organize the year and praying through it. But as far as like a more detailed, specific example, it's like we've just finished preaching the Jesus is Better series out of Hebrews. Mm-hmm. What was the process to get to the place where we were ready to preach through Hebrews, focusing on those Jesus is Better passages?
Right. So let me back up 6 months from that. First of the year, we were a church that just experienced disaffiliation. So we went through some basic teaching of what our values were coming into that new season as a church. Then we got into Lent and the Easter season, and we focused a little more on the resurrection accounts from the Easter story, if you will, and the post-resurrection accounts. In June, we spent 4 weeks talking about stewardship, and we were able to expand our understanding of stewardship to be more than just financial stewardship. We talked about stewardship of relationships, stewardship of opportunities, and then the last of that was just some teaching on financial stewardship. And then we welcomed some new members of our staff, you included.
Yep.
And you and I had sat down prior to that to say, okay, what do we want to talk about moving in? And you had a great suggestion from a Wesleyan perspective of preach, pray, or die. And so we went, how do we approach that? What scripture we look at? And we landed, obviously, in the book of Hebrews. Mm-hmm. And we spent the past 3 months working through the book of Hebrews in the series we call Jesus is Better. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of gives us a 9-month look at where the church has been. And we've hit it pretty hard, I think, in the book of Hebrews for 3 months. So I would anticipate our next series will be a little more rooted in the narratives of Jesus and the Gospels and the promises of God with us that we discern from those gospel narratives.
Yeah, it's interesting. You pointed out that we sort of had a direction, and then it morphed into something else. How do you deal with the loss of that idea and its replacement with something else?
It's an interesting way to phrase that. I think that it's sometimes my first ideas are not my best ideas, right?
It's true.
And I'm sure that's the same for you. And so together, as you and I are learning to work together in that process, I bring to the table 6, almost 7 years now of experience of Riverside culture. You're bringing a different perspective. And so there's balance in, okay, it's a fresh and new idea, preach, pray, or die. But is that something that's being received well? So I think we kind of massaged that a little bit and landed in Hebrews and really took what the Scripture gave us, the superiority of Jesus that's lifted up over and over again in the book of Hebrews, and we landed on Jesus is better. So that's kind of how we let go of an original idea. We can come back to it another time. And I think sometimes those original ideas that we kind of put on the editing room floor kind of reemerge in maybe not an entire sermon series, but maybe in we'll just say a flavor of a sermon. We may come back and circle back to that idea.
Yeah. So you talked about like knowing the context and the culture of your congregation, and where for Riverside and here. I think the language we've used before is the cute series don't go very far because people want the Bible taught.
Correct.
But you've been in some churches where the cute series, can move people and How do you make that distinction? How do you pick up on that in the local churches?
Yeah, I think it's trial and error. Right? Some congregations that I've served, there was maybe less maturity overall in the congregation, spiritual maturity, biblical knowledge, than what I've experienced here at Riverside. And so what I like to say is at Riverside, not only is there permission to teach the scriptures, it's expected.
Yeah.
Right? And so I appreciate that. Whereas in other congregations I've served, it's tolerated. And so just realizing through trial and error where the congregation may be, and understanding even in a church like Riverside, there's a breadth of experience. And so there's some maybe on a lower level of spiritual maturity, and there's some even on a higher level. And we've got to try to be true to the scriptures, and at the same time offering applications, if you will, that are going to hit people where they are, wherever they may be in their journey of faith.
So I assume that that's something on a week by week basis you're paying attention to. But is that also something you're paying attention to within the flow and the progression of a season of preaching, whether that's a series or going through the liturgical calendar?
Yeah, I think so. I think a series. Well, first of all, the scripture, as we learn in Hebrews, is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword. And so because it's not just a dead entity that we, like the Reader's Digest that we're reading from. It's God is working in the midst of the scriptures. So it kind of takes on a life of its own. And maybe after 2 or 3 sermons in a series, you may realize, wow, the Spirit is really opening some things up amidst the congregation. People are talking, asking questions, and that may lead you to maybe go a little deeper, maybe press a little harder, so to speak, all the while trying to be pastoral in the midst of it all. And so, as the 23rd Psalm reminds us, the shepherd has a rod and a staff, and that rod and staff sometimes can be very comforting. And so preaching in a way that invites the congregation to take steps of faith, even though it may be difficult and challenging, is in itself pastoral. But at the same time, there may be some circumstances in the life of the congregation. Maybe it's a significant leader who's dying of cancer, or maybe someone's passed away that we've been praying for quite some time, and maybe it's a tragic situation. You have to understand what's going on in the life of the congregation and kind of speak to that in a way that brings the comfort of God in the midst of that. So I think it can be week to week. Sometimes it's service to service, depending on how you approach that. So you may have a different culture in the traditional service versus the contemporary service. Mm-hmm. And as we continue to work on potential church plant in another part of town, that's got its own culture as well. And so we've got to figure out where the Spirit may be leading us and those congregations at the time.
So has there ever been a time in your career that you've had to, you've had a progression planned, a series, and you've gotten in the middle of it, and there's either been an event from the outside or something that happens in your spirit that you have to, get off the plan and do something entirely different, either to speak to that tragedy that happens in the local church or in the wider culture.
Sure.
Or speak to something that's happened within you that you just can't keep.
Sure. Couple of examples. 9/11, of course, was a time in the life of the church where we had to press pause on what we thought we were going to do and address a very significant issue that was taking place.
I was an 8th grader, so
well, that's reality, I understand. So COVID, was a big, significant shift in what was going on in the life of the church at the time. I remember a time on a Sunday morning at a previous congregation where I came in, and there was a family with a young man, and this young man was visibly upset. So as I talked to them, he shared that his best friend had been killed in a car wreck the night before, that night, and he had just learned about it when they got up. And so the Spirit led me to just scrap everything that I planned on preaching on and offer hope from the Scriptures, as well as testimony of my own experience as a young man losing friends tragically. And we just scrapped everything that we planned to do. Didn't matter what was in the bulletin. We realized that there was a significant event taking place in the life of the community, and specifically one family's life, and we we just addressed it. And I have always believed that if you preach to broken hearts, you'll always have an audience. And so while I knew of one circumstance that people were going through tragedy, I have to assume there are others that I don't know about that could benefit from hearing that kind of message of hope as well.
Yeah. Well, I have one final kind of big picture question around long-term sermon planning and how we do that. We have a colleague who likes to tell the story that for 2 years he preached Rick Warren's sermon the week after Rick Warren preached it. He loved Rick Warren's preaching. He wanted to figure out how he did it. So he didn't do it like word for word, but his flow, like the scriptures he used, he used that as the template for his own preaching. Have you ever done something like that, or do you think that there would be a benefit in doing something like that?
I think that there's always benefit to learn what God is doing in other congregations and from other preachers. There are a ton of preachers that are better than me, better than you, right? And we can learn from that.
There are a
couple, one or two, right? So I don't think we ever want to get to a place where we think that we've got it all figured out, no matter how long we've been doing it or how good we may be at it. So it's good to listen to other preachers, but I don't know if I would take for 2 years. You said,
yeah.
I don't know if I would do that. I don't know if I would do that. But there's nothing new under the sun, right? And so there's always something we can learn from others and apply to what we're doing in the life of a church. So I think there has to be balance in that. Again, I don't know if I would take somebody else's stuff and try to make my own for that lengthy of a period. Now, if it's a Saturday night Buckeye game late and I don't have anything, then I may need to.
Then you're preaching Wesley Standard Sermon.
I may
8.
need to repurpose and reinvent some ideas that I hear somewhere else. Yeah. But I don't think it's me personally. I don't know if it's a healthy thing to get into that kind of routine. I have to exercise the gift that God has given me in the context that God has entrusted to me, using all the resources that's available, but making it authentic and my own in that moment. Not that individual wasn't making it authentic. My style would be that after 2 or 3 times in a row doing that, I'd get a little bored with it. Yeah. So.
Well, I mean, I think that the closest I've ever come to doing something like that is a couple years back. I preached through the Wesley Standard 44 sermons.
Okay.
And it was very personally edifying, but I'm not sure it was actually good preaching material, like in the context of what the church needed. Like I think while it was a beneficial practice for me to be reminded of the distinctives of our movement,
right?
And there was even value in teaching that. I think that extended period ultimately wasn't as beneficial as it would have been if I would have spread it over, say, 4 or 5 ordinary times.
Okay. But that's probably a good idea.
Yeah. I think it's time to put the tool back in the toolbox and move on. But if you are listening and you're a pastor and there is something you're struggling with that you want us to talk about, feel free to email us at recoveringmethodism@gmail.com, and we will see if that's a tool in our toolbox, and if it's not, then we may just have a special guest to help us better understand it, because we're all in this together.
That's right.
So.
Thank you for listening to the Recovering Methodism podcast. We hope your heart has been strangely warmed. Be sure to like, subscribe, share with your friends, and leave a 5-star review. God bless.